the beginning, everything felt right. I was the person everyone expected me to be. Kind, accommodating, and always putting others first. I believed in the goodness of people because it was all I had ever known. My life was full of routines, familiar faces, and a deep sense of comfort that came from knowing my role in every relationship. I was the friend who was always there, the one who would pick up the phone at 2 a.m., no questions asked. I was the one who would drop everything to help, who would listen without interrupting, who would give advice without ever needing any in return. It wasn't just what I did, it was who I was. When I look back now, I see how much of myself I gave away without even realizing it. I thought I was being selfless, thought that by giving my time, my energy and my love so freely I was doing the right thing. And maybe I was, at least for a while. The people around me seemed to value what I brought to their lives. They praised me for my empathy, for my ability to understand them when no one else could. I was the glue that held everyone together, and I took pride in that role. I thought it made me special, made me important. I never stopped to wonder if it was draining me because I didn't feel the weight of it yet. I remember how it felt to walk into a room full of friends and feel like I belonged there completely. Like I was seen and valued for who I was. I didn't realize at the time that I was being seen not for who I truly was, but for what I could provide to others. The version of myself that they knew was one molded to fit their needs. I was the agreeable one, the one who went along with everyone's plans, who laughed at jokes that weren't funny, who nodded and smiled even when I felt differently inside. It was easy to fall into this pattern because it was comfortable, familiar, and it made everyone happy, or at least it made everyone else happy. There's a kind of bliss that comes from not questioning the world around you. I floated along in that bliss for a long time, secure in the knowledge that I was a good person, doing good things for the people I loved. It never crossed my mind that there might be more to life, more to me, than this. It's strange to think about it now, how oblivious I was to the cracks forming beneath the surface, how I missed the signs that something was shifting. It was like standing on the shore, watching the waves lap gently at my feet, unaware that a storm was brewing far out at sea, its winds already beginning to stir the waters around me. I remember specific moments, now tinged with the bitter clarity of hindsight. The times I felt a small, sharp twinge of hurt when someone dismissed my opinion or took my kindness just for granted. The nights I stayed up late, replaying conversations in my mind, wondering why I felt empty after what should have been a joyful gathering. I ignored those feelings, pushing them aside as overthinking, as sensitivity. I convinced myself that it was nothing, that I was imagining things. I wanted so badly to believe that the people in my life saw me for who I truly was, that they valued me as much as I valued them. But slowly, quietly, the balance began to tip. I started to feel the strain of always being the one who gave and gave without asking for anything in return. It was subtle at first, like a light rain that you barely notice. I didn't realize that those small, seemingly insignificant moments were the beginning of something much bigger. Something that would eventually wash away everything I thought I knew about myself and the people around me. It started so small, I almost missed it. A comment here, a forgotten promise there, tiny slights that I brushed off as accidents, as misunderstandings. I told myself that everyone makes mistakes, that nobody is perfect. I was used to making excuses for others because it felt easier than confronting the truth. If someone forgot something important to me, I'd laugh it off and say it was no big deal. If they hurt my feelings, I'd swallow the pain and tell myself I was being too sensitive. It was a pattern, one I had perfected over the years. Rationalize, excuse, forgive. I was always the peacemaker, the one who smoothed over conflicts and made sure everyone felt okay. I thought that was a strength, that it made me a good person. But as time went on, I started to notice a shift in the way people treated me. It was as if they had learned that no matter what they did, I would always be there, always be the one to bend and compromise. I became the go-to person for favors, the one everyone turned to when they needed help, but rarely when they just wanted to share a moment of joy. The scales were tipping, and I felt it like an imbalance deep in my chest. At first, I didn't know what to make of it. I felt like I was standing in the middle of a crowded room, surrounded by people who claimed to care about me, and yet I had never felt so alone. I found myself doubting my own worth, questioning if maybe I wasn't as important as I had always believed. Maybe I was the problem. Maybe I was expecting too much. I'd always been the one who needed less, who asked for nothing, and I wondered if I had finally run dry, if there was simply nothing left of me to give. The shift inside me was slow, like the tide turning, almost imperceptible until it was too late. I began to change, though I didn't realize it at first. I was more guarded, less willing to open up. I started to say no, more often started to draw lines in the sand that I had never drawn before. It was subtle, these tiny rebellions against the person I had always been. And when I started to change, the people around me noticed. They asked why I was being distant, why I wasn't as cheerful as I used to be. They wondered why I'd started to pull back, why I wasn't as eager to please. They couldn't see that it wasn't a choice I had made lightly. It was a survival instinct, a response to the constant quiet erosion of my spirit. Their actions had pushed me to this point, though they would never see it that way. To them, it was as if I had changed overnight, as if I had become someone unrecognizable. I remember the moment I realized I couldn't go on like this anymore. It wasn't a dramatic event, no shouting match or tear-filled confrontation. It was a quiet realization, like the sun breaking through the clouds after a long gray storm. I was sitting alone, replaying a conversation I had just had with a friend who had once again dismissed something important to me, brushed it off like it was nothing. And in that moment I felt something snap inside me, like a thread that had been stretched too thin for too long. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't keep pretending that everything was okay, that I was okay. It was as if I had been wearing a mask my whole life, and suddenly, I didn't have the strength to hold it up any longer. I was exhausted, not just physically but emotionally, the kind of exhaustion that seeps into your bones and makes you question everything you thought you knew about yourself. I sat there, in silence, feeling the weight of that realization settle over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. And for the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to feel the sadness, the disappointment, the anger that I had buried so deep inside. I let it all wash over me, and in that moment I knew things could never go back to the way they were. In the days and weeks that followed that breaking point, I felt like I was standing on the edge of an abyss, staring down into a version of myself that I no longer recognized. The realization that I had been living for others, shaped by their desires and expectations, left me hollow and disoriented. I had spent so much time being what everyone else needed that I had lost sight of who I actually was. It was like waking up from a long, deep sleep, only to find the world had changed while I wasn't paying attention. And worse, I had changed too, but not in a way that felt like growth. It felt like I had been molded and reshaped into something smaller, something quieter, something that took up less space. The first thing I did was retreat. I withdrew from social situations that once felt comfortable but now felt suffocating. I stopped replying to texts as quickly, ignored calls, and made excuses not to go out. I needed space, needed time to breathe and think without the constant pressure of everyone else's expectations weighing on me. It was as if I was peeling away layers of my own skin, trying to find the raw, unfiltered version of myself beneath everything I had become. The silence was both deafening and liberating for the first time, and I wasn't worried about anyone else's feelings. I wasn't concerned about being the dependable friend or the understanding partner. I was just there, existing in a space that was mine alone. But the quiet brought with it a different kind of challenge. I was left alone with my thoughts, with all the questions I had been too scared to ask myself before. Who was I without the roles I played for others? What did I want when I wasn't trying to please anyone else? These questions haunted me, echoing in the emptiness I had created by stepping back. I realized I had spent so much time looking outward, trying to gauge the needs of those around me, that I had never truly looked inward. And when I did, I found a stranger staring back at me. I didn't know what I liked, what I wanted, what I dreamed of. It was like standing in front of a mirror and seeing a blurred reflection, indistinct and unrecognizable. Slowly, tentatively, I began the process of rebuilding. It felt like starting over from scratch, picking up pieces of myself that had been scattered and broken. I started small, focusing on the basics. What did I enjoy? What brought me peace? For so long I had tailored my likes and dislikes to fit in with the people around me. If they loved a certain type of music, I learned to love it too. If they had a hobby, I adopted it as my own. It was easier that way. Easier to blend in and avoid conflict. But now, I had no one to please but myself, and I realized I didn't even know what that looked like. I began experimenting, trying things I had never had the courage to do before, because I was always afraid of what others might think. I started reading books I had always been curious about but never picked up because they didn't fit the image people had of me. I listened to music I had never given a chance, let myself explore new interests without the fear of judgment. It was a strange, exhilarating experience, rediscovering who I was without the influence of anyone else's opinions. I felt like a child again, seeing the world with fresh eyes, untainted by the need to conform. As I took these small steps, something incredible began to happen. I started to feel a sense of empowerment, a strength I hadn't realized was there. It wasn't the loud, aggressive kind of strength. It was quiet, steady, and deeply rooted, like the foundation of a house that had been rebuilt after a storm. I realized that for the first time in my life, I was setting boundaries. I wasn't just saying no to others. I was saying yes to myself. It was a radical shift in perspective, one that took everyone by surprise, including me. The reactions from the people around me were mixed, as I expected they would be. Some were confused, others hurt. They asked why I wasn't the same person I used to be, why I wasn't as available, as accommodating. They didn't understand that it wasn't a choice I made lightly. It was a necessity, a matter of survival. I couldn't keep pouring from an empty cup, couldn't continue sacrificing pieces of myself to make others whole. I explained it as best I could, but not everyone wanted to listen. They missed the old version of me, the one who would always say yes, who never pushed back, who bent and twisted herself to fit into the spaces they needed filled. I lost some people during this time, people who couldn't handle the changes I was making, who preferred the old malleable version of me. It was painful, and I mourned those losses deeply. But as the initial sting faded, I realized something important. The relationships that couldn't survive my growth were never truly about me. They were about the version of me that existed for their convenience, their comfort. And if I had to lose those relationships to find myself, then so be it. In their place, new connections began to form. Relationships built on mutual respect, on the foundation of who I was becoming rather than who I had been. These people didn't ask me why I had changed. They didn't expect me to justify my evolution. They simply accepted me as I was, in all my messy, imperfect glory. And for the first time, I felt seen, truly seen. Not for what I could do for someone, but for who I was at my core. It wasn't easy. Every step forward felt like it came with a step back. I had moments of doubt, times when I wondered if I was doing the right thing, if I was being selfish. The old habits of people-pleasing ran deep, and there were days when I was tempted to revert, to fall back into the comfortable role I knew so well. But I held firm, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it hurt, because I knew deep down that this was the only way I could truly be happy, truly be free. The most surprising part of this process was realizing how much strength I had within me. For so long, I'd thought of myself as weak, as someone who needed others to define her. But as I rebuilt myself from the ashes of who I used to be, I discovered a resilience I didn't know I possessed. I realized that I wasn't fragile. I was fierce. I had survived the slow erosion of my spirit, the constant quiet taking from people who claimed to love me. And now, standing on the other side of it, I felt like I was finally becoming who I was always meant to be. The journey wasn't over, and I knew it never truly would be. Self-discovery is a process, a continual unfolding. But for the first time, I felt a sense of peace. I was no longer running from myself, no longer hiding behind the roles I used to play. I was stepping into the fullness of who I was, and it was the most liberating feeling in the world. I realized then that this wasn't about changing who I was. It was about shedding the parts of me that had been imposed by others. The expectations and obligations that had weighed me down. It was about reclaiming my voice, my needs, my desires. It was about finally choosing myself. It's strange how after so much turmoil, the feeling that follows isn't what you might expect. I thought that once I started setting boundaries, once I let go of the old accommodating version of myself, there would be a rush of relief or a surge of triumph. But instead, it felt quieter than that, almost anticlimactic in its simplicity. It felt like standing on a mountaintop, taking in the view after a long, grueling climb. It wasn't a moment of exhilaration or celebration. It was a moment of calm, a deep, profound exhale. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I was alone with myself, and it felt peaceful. This new version of me wasn't something that appeared overnight. It was built slowly, piece by piece, out of the rubble of what I had once been. I found parts of myself I hadn't seen in years, small fragments that I had tucked away because they didn't fit the image others had of me. I began to nurture those parts, to give them space to grow. I started to trust my own instincts again, to listen to that small, steady voice inside that had been drowned out for so long by the noise of everyone else's expectations. It was like learning to speak a new language, my own language, one that had been buried under layers of people-pleasing and self-sacrifice. In the process, I became protective of this newfound sense of self. It was delicate, fragile in its infancy, like a sapling breaking through the soil for the first time. I knew it wouldn't take much to crush it, to send me spiraling back into old habits. There were moments when I was tempted to fall back into the comfortable rhythms of before, to make myself smaller just to keep the peace. It was a constant battle between the old and the new, a tug of war inside me that sometimes left me feeling exhausted and raw. But I fought for it, fiercely. I fought for myself in a way I had never done before, and in that fight, I found a strength I didn't know I had. People continued to ask why I had changed, why I wasn't as available as I used to be, why I seemed distant or different. It was as if they couldn't comprehend that I had outgrown the version of myself they were comfortable with. I used to feel the need to explain, to soften the blow, to make excuses for my boundaries. But slowly, I stopped. I realized that I didn't owe anyone an explanation for my growth. I wasn't responsible for managing their discomfort. If they missed the old me, that was their burden to bear, not mine. I had spent enough time apologizing for things that weren't my fault. This time, I chose silence. I chose myself. I started to notice the way people reacted to this new version of me. Some withdrew, confused and frustrated by the shift. They weren't used to me saying no, weren't prepared for the fact that I was no longer willing to bend over backwards to meet their needs. I watched as they struggled to adjust, as they tried to guilt or manipulate me back into my old role. It was eye-opening, seeing how quickly some relationships crumbled when I stopped playing the part they had cast me in. It hurt to lose people I thought would be in my life forever, but it was also liberating. I realized I had been holding on to connections that were built on a shaky foundation of convenience, rather than genuine love or respect. At the same time, something beautiful began to happen. In the space left by those who couldn't accept my growth, new people started to appear. They didn't ask why I had changed because they had no preconceived notions of who I was supposed to be. They met me where I was, in the present, without the baggage of the past weighing us down. These new friendships felt different, lighter, more equal. There was no expectation that I would always be the one to give without receiving. For the first time, I experienced what it felt like to be truly seen, not as a role or a function, but as a whole, complex human being. In romantic relationships, the shift was even more profound. I had spent so much of my life being agreeable, going along with whatever my partner wanted just to keep the peace. I thought that was love, compromise, self-sacrifice, putting someone else's needs before my own. But I realized that what I had been doing wasn't love. It was a performance, an act of service driven by fear and insecurity. I was afraid that if I showed my true self, with all my flaws and desires, I would be rejected. But now, I was no longer willing to hide. I wasn't interested in relationships where I had to play a part. I wanted something real, something rooted in mutual respect and honesty. The first time I stood up for myself in a relationship, it felt like stepping off a cliff. I was terrified. I could feel the old fear rising up, the voice in my head telling me that I was being difficult, that I would drive them away. But I did it anyway. I spoke my truth, clearly and without apology. And instead of the backlash I expected, I was met with understanding. They listened. They didn't try to change my mind or make me feel guilty. In that moment, I realized how different it could be, how healthy relationships are supposed to work. It was a revelation, one that made me determined to never settle for anything less again. This entire process taught me something fundamental about change. It isn't always about becoming someone new. Sometimes, it's about shedding the layers of who you've been pretending to be, peeling back the masks until you're left with something raw and authentic. I hadn't changed as much as I had unburdened to myself from the expectations that had been placed on me. I was no longer carrying the weight of everyone else's needs and desires. I was lighter, freer. I was myself. I think back to the old version of me sometimes, the one who would bend and twist herself into whatever shape was needed just to keep everyone happy. I feel a pang of sadness for her because she didn't know any better. She thought that was the only way to be loved. She thought that sacrificing her own happiness was a small price to pay for the approval and affection of others. But I don't blame her. I know now that she was doing the best she could with what she knew at the time. And in a way, I'm grateful for her because she led me here, to this place of self-acceptance and strength. I've come to realize that the people who ask why I've changed don't really want an answer. They're not interested in the journey I've been on or the struggles I've faced. They just want the comfort of the old me, the version of me that was easy and predictable. But I'm not here to make anyone comfortable anymore. I'm here to live authentically, to embrace the messinesses of who I am without apology. I've learned that the right people won't need an explanation. They will simply accept me as I am, in all my flawed, evolving glory. In the end, I didn't become someone different. I became who I was always meant to be. And that's the most powerful change of all.